Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast. Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching. I'm Katie.
And I'm Elena.
And Elena, we're back to crowdsourcing for another amazing episode of the Endurance Drive podcast. I'm so excited to be here.
I know. I love crowdsourcing. I'm always so impressed by our community and just the depth and insights that they all share. So yeah, really excited about this episode. I think self-belief is it's a huge part of performance. It's a huge part of life. And so we're finally digging a little more into it, which will be really fun.
Totally. I feel like we should actually maybe also tell our listeners the story of how we even came up with this topic, because we had all of these ideas swirling around and we were talking about like external validation and the feelings of being enough. And we were talking about belief. We were talking about confidence. And then we realized we had so many ideas that we were actually having trouble organizing them for an episode that was just us. And I feel like whenever we have that feeling, the answer is always just turn to the community and see what the community has to say. And once again, the community delivered. So we have probably more content than we even know what to do with, all about self-belief.
Absolutely. Our community is amazing. And when in doubt, turn to the others. We will figure it out at some point, but we're just muddling through all of this thinking right now. And this is super helpful to hear other people's perspectives. So before we dive into the results of people sending in their own thoughts, we should definitely start with where we always start, coaching and training insights. So Katie, do you want to kick it off with what you have this week for insights?
Sure. Yeah. So I have 2 insights this week. The first one is a quick one, but I think an important one. So I have talked extensively about how I am in my off-season era, but I'm sort of at the end of the off-season, which means I've been going out and venturing a little bit. And I actually just spent about 2 weeks in California for some work stuff. And it's awesome because the weather's amazing here and you can ride your bike and go swimming and go trail running kind of all the time. But I think an important reminder for me that I like to share with other people in their off season is that I find that I'm way less intentional around fueling during like fun adventure trail rides and runs and stuff like that than I would be in, for example, a race simulation where I sit down and I'm like, this is the number of grams that I'm planning to consume per hour, and I stay on a schedule about it. And so I think, probably getting in about the right amount of fuel, but I'm not always nailing that timing. And so sometimes I feel like energy is dipping a little bit. And when I zoom out and look at the volume of some of these adventures, they're about as big as a race sim type of thing. So this is just a reminder for everyone that even if you're in the off season from being really intentional about planned workouts and a training log, that doesn't mean you're in the off season from fueling. Always be super, super smart about it. So I'm going back to a whole lot of scratch super fuel in my bottles for these really long rides so that I feel topped off the whole day.
Yep, I am so guilty of that as well. When you're just going for a hike, sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I'll just maybe have a few M&Ms and you kind of forget the whole structure around it. So great reminder. I am also taking that to heart right now.
Totally. Okay. And then my second insight, this is so fresh. It's coming off something that actually happened to me today. But yeah, out here in California, I've been doing some work at Stanford. So I don't know if everyone knows this, but right now, in addition to coaching, I am what's called a postdoc at a lab called the Mind and Body Lab. And so postdoc is basically just a post-PhD research position. And I gave a talk today in that lab that was very different from any talk I've ever given before. But that lab is what I'm going to call a person first, research second lab. And the lab is actually really interested in kind of researchers' stories and what got them to the research that they were doing. And so it was the first time ever that I gave a talk where I actually got to talk about, what I love about coaching and how I've been trying to bring that into research. And I'm sitting here right now feeling more blissed out than I ever have post-research talk. I even have the energy to come and record a podcast because I think it really speaks to how awesome it is when you feel like you can be really authentic about what you love doing. And I often feel this tension in the research space where I don't always want to lean into, what I do as an athlete or what I do as a coach, because I don't want people to think that I don't take the research side of it seriously. But this was the first time that I actually felt that synergy between, hey, these things don't have to actually be at odds with each other. And the coaching that I do really supports my research into things like mindset, especially in the sport and health space. So I don't know, I guess my insight or my advice is try to lean into authenticity. It feels really, really good to do it. And I feel like something has just clicked for me that I think is actually related to a lot about self-belief that we're going to talk about today. So yeah, feeling really good.
Yay. Yeah, I love this insight. And I think it's just, the universe has a way of rewarding when you're in alignment with all of your different pieces of yourself. And maybe that's a little woo for some people, but I definitely think that rings true for when you're putting your authentic self out there. So I'm really, really glad you had that experience because that makes me really, really happy to hear.
Thank you. And I will say we're both kind of on this spiritual journey. I think Jim is on the spiritual journey. Kevin's probably on the spiritual journey. So I think the podcast is moving in a very spiritual direction and I am here for it. Let's keep that momentum going.
Definitely. Yep. It's all about, have yourself vibrating on a high energy level and the universe will reward you.
It will. Okay. With that, your turn. Coaching and training insights.
Okay. So go back to maybe less spiritual, more grounded. Mine is just taking little injuries seriously. A lot of people right now are in like the peak of marathon builds and having little niggles here and there. And seriously, the worst thing ever would be to push yourself just a little bit overboard to the point where you can't hit your long runs or maybe let alone even run the marathon that you're trying to do in a month or two. So take those little injuries seriously. My general rules are if it's getting worse while you're doing the activity and or it's bothering you post activity, it's not just something that is like a little tight at the beginning and it loosens up and then it's fine, then I'm concerned about that and I want a few days, I usually say 3 days of like full rest from the activity. It's totally okay to cross train if it's not bothering you, but like usually in the running world, don't run on it for a few days, see how it's feeling. And then also, we're coaches, but we're not everything. So definitely involve a good PT. Hopefully you can find one in your area or like talk to other people in the community of recommendations because it's just so helpful to have an on the ground perspective on what's going on. And you will be fine if you catch things early. It doesn't have to progress into something scary. It's totally okay to take rest. It'll sometimes help you in other ways as well. We would much rather you be slightly undertrained than overtrained and unable to do the race. So something I've been picking up on, just take your little niggles seriously.
Totally. This is such good advice. This reminds me of things we say all the time, which are like 1 to 2 days of rest can prevent 1 to 2 months of rest. So always keep that perspective and also have a really good local network. So you shouldn't have to scramble to find a PT once you're injured. If you can find a PT before then, when things are good, then you can usually get in a lot faster. So just think about establishing that local network now, even if it's your off season, even if you're feeling amazing, PTs are still really good resources to have.
Definitely. And then my last one is just in relation to the adventures in the off season that we should be fueling well from Katie's advice, just do them. Have things be fun in the off season. I think that's a really important thing to remember, like coming off of a big training season. I know it can also be pretty mentally hard to keep things feeling fun and fresh. So do the things that you just enjoy doing about being outside and not worry at all about the kind of training benefits it has, even though I'm sure it will be beneficial to you in some way if you're going for, a hike for a few hours or doing that adventure bike ride that you haven't gotten to go mountain biking or something. Whatever it is that's like feels new and exciting, just make sure that you schedule time for that for yourself because I think it makes a big difference.
Plus fun. Yeah. I'm in my pickleball career season, so it's really great.
Pickleball is so great. We also got into beach volleyball recently and I am loving it. It is so fun.
That's so cool. All right. I'm inspired. So coaching and training insight is go try beach volleyball. As it gets really cold in New England, it's a great time to do that.
Yeah, might have to be indoor beach. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I think that takes us to the main content today. So I feel like people know our protocol right now, which is we send out a Google form to all of our friends, all of our community. I want to say thank you to people who bear with me emailing you and texting you and sending out Discord messages and Strava messages about filling out our form. But we did a forum this time all about self-belief. So Elena, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we asked about in this forum?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying at a high level, one of the reasons that we were really interested in the self-belief concept is not just because Katie and I were brainstorming on a ton of things and wanted to get people's perspectives on this broad topic, but also because it truly is a huge part of performance, especially these endurance events. And as coaches, it's something that we are really trying to cultivate in our athletes, especially going into race days, making sure that people have had a plan for practicing and developing that self-belief because it will have such a huge impact on the outcome. So with that said, we were just like, let's see what people think about this. Let's start with very simple metrics that are just quick fill outs. So what's your current level of self-belief? And recognizing that can change hour by hour, day by day, week by week. But in this moment, what's your current level of self-belief? And then at what point in your life do you feel like you had the highest level of self-belief? So a lot of people could say, right now at my life, I have the most self-belief I've ever had, or when I was a teenager, or when I was a little kid, and just curious of how people felt about that, looking back over their history. And then we had the more open-ended responses, which were what has helped develop your self-belief, what has gotten in the way of you having self-belief, and then stories of where your self-belief has helped you achieve something that you didn't think you could achieve, and when you've doubted your self-belief and how you got through that moment. And then any other tips or feedback or thoughts on the broader topic of self-belief or how it relates to these other things that we mentioned, like being enough or, confidence, performance, etc. So a lot of perspectives came in from that because there was so much room for open-ended interpretation in addition to some kind of concrete thoughts. So we tried our best to pull out the themes of those different topics, specifically breaking it down into how people have been thinking about developing self-belief, how they've maintained that, what are some practices that we can all learn from and try to implement in our daily lives, and then reflecting on the things that have gotten in the way of that self-belief and how we can recognize that, accept that, and move forward and be stronger together and individually. So yeah, let's see where we go from there.
Yeah. And something I just wanted to add to all of this that was a really helpful recap is that it sounds like everyone really struggles with self-belief from time to time and also has used self-belief to leverage for their performance. So really shout out to everyone who is willing to be vulnerable in this forum. It's really hard to do, to even reflect on, but I think it's just a shared perspective. So a little bit of empathy out there and kind of common humanity in the sense that self-belief can be really, really hard for most athletes and most people.
Yeah, it's an ebb and a flow, and we fully recognize that. So we're just going to explore kind of the nuances of that ebb and flow and when it's good and when it's not so good and what we can do about it.
Perfect. All right. So first topic, how do we actually develop our self-belief? Want to take the first one?
Yeah. Okay. So the main thing, basically everyone hit on, probably because we're skewed towards endurance athletes. So that does make sense. But people all mention pushing yourself and showing that you can achieve something that you didn't think you could achieve. Basically like taking on the hard thing, realizing you can do the hard thing and letting that snowball effect start happening. So I'll give one quick summary quote that someone's put in that reflects this on a high level. They say, doing hard things is succeeding as well as failing. Overcoming obstacles, developing grit, discipline, and perseverance. The more success I see, the more I feel good about myself. On the flip side, the more challenges I face, the more I trust myself to get through the hard times. I think I love that. It reflects how just putting yourself out there, as Max said on a previous episode, having the courage to try is something that you not only see on the positive side of, oh, I actually achieved that, I think I can achieve other things, but also realizing that when you're faced with something hard, you have the tools to keep pushing through it because you've done that before. So just putting yourself out there seems to be one of the most amazing ways that people kick off this flywheel effect of developing their self-belief. And clearly endurance sports is a way that that is practiced very tangibly on a daily basis if you're training or going to these races, etc. So I think that's a really cool way of using our sports to help ourselves develop.
Absolutely. And I think something related to this that came through, we actually got a recommendation from a listener to a couple of different podcasts that talk about sort of the neuroscience behind how this all works in our brains. And again, we are not neuroscientists, so I wouldn't say that we can speak on this with all of our own primary knowledge, but it seems like the research shows that self-belief really is kind of a muscle. So you grow it each time you push yourself. So there's regions in the brain that are related to this kind of grit and perseverance and tenacity. And as you exercise them, they get bigger and bigger. So the idea is if you do something that you don't really want to do, but you push yourself to do it, that region's bigger such that next time it'll be a little bit easier to get there and you can kind of level up that goal. And I think we talk about this too. I think a long time ago on a podcast, we talked about the idea of resilience data points. And a resilience data point might be something where you really, really didn't want to get in the pool. It was freezing cold. It was 6 a.m, but you did it and you smashed your workout. And then the next time it was a little bit easier to get in the pool because you believed that you could do it. So every time you push yourself, it matters. And you don't even have to necessarily like hit the goal. It's even just getting in the water or whatever that is. It's just the exercise of pushing past that. I don't really know if I want to do this. And getting there seems like a really effective way to kind of increase that willpower. So we also have 2 recommendations for podcasts from this listener. So if you want to listen to, I believe these are both Huberman Lab podcasts, but How to Increase Your Willpower and Tenacity from October 9th, 2023, and an interview with David Goggins, How to Build an Immense Inner Strength from January 1st of this year. Both of those speak to this idea of actually the neuroscience behind pushing yourself and then getting better at building your self-belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll link both of those in the show notes so that people can access those quickly. But I've definitely experienced it for myself, that resilience. What did you call it again, Katie? The resilience data point, RDP. Oh, love that. RDP. Okay, cool. I've always called it my cookie jar, which is just easier to remember.
I like that too.
Yeah, basically like having those memories you can pull from of the hard things you've overcome that remind you that you can do more hard things. And then interestingly, this listener also shared that because it is like a muscle, it's also a muscle that gets weaker if you don't practice it. And I've also experienced that too, when you go through phases of being like really tired and, you know, start slipping on a few different things, and you realize like, oh, my whole like system of believing that I can do these hard things is getting harder and harder. It's like this very inertia based process. So it's just a reminder, even like when you're having those motivation lulls or really tough weeks, even just doing one really simple thing that you don't want to do and giving yourself grace to like let it be just a very simple thing, but like making the bed can kick off a flywheel of doing these other things. And I think that's also talked about in research often with like atomic habits or whatever. Just doing the little thing can really, really help. And the last thing I'll say on that is I experienced this recently because I did go through a phase when I was like 23, I think, when I was really into the cold showers just because it was hard. And I was like, I'll practice being, pretty tough by taking a cold shower. Every time I take a shower, it's always going to be cold. If I'm biking in the rain and I'm still cold, I'm going to take a cold shower. And I was like really interested by how after like a couple of days of that, it actually felt like my new normal and it wasn't even that hard anymore. And I have not done that in years. I am not that crazy anymore. But I was on a trip last week. We're rafting on a river that was probably 45 degrees in temperature. And the first day we jumped in the river and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so cold. And then the next day it felt kind of normal to get in. And I was like, oh, I'm really excited about this. And the next day I was like, okay, I'm really excited to get in the water. Like first thing, it's going to feel really good. And then I'll be out of it. And it just reminded me that my brain is so adaptable. And I love that about how we're built as humans, that we are so adaptable and that we can reset our expectations and, pull from my cookie jar, RDP or whatever, and remind ourselves to go do these things that becomes a new normal that makes it seem less challenging each time.
Yeah. This also reminds me too, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about goals and I talked about how I had set some goals for racing next year. And then I ended up modifying my goals because I don't think the goals were actually challenging me all that much. And I think it's interesting to think that maybe if I had picked goals that didn't actually challenge me, then that muscle would have shrunk just a little bit. And maybe I'd be getting fitter in different ways or doing different things physically. But the brain muscle that's really pushing you to keep trying for the next level, I think is a big one. So yes, it's super important to start small. But once you do that, and once you kind of jump in the water every single day and it's no longer, such a shocking experience, I feel like then it's like, okay, well, how do I do this even more? Or I don't think you have to do anything more on the river trip because that's already pretty badass. But generally, always think about leveling up once you adjust to this as the new normal for sure.
Yeah. And I would caveat that too with like, okay, then we run to the slippery slope of do you always have to be pushing yourself to be tougher and tougher? I think there's a space for figuring out what's the right level of, next level for me. Or, hey, if I have so much going on right now that maintaining is challenging, or actually I need to lower one thing so that the rest feel more manageable, that's also totally fine. And I think that I felt this, so I would imagine other people have felt this as well, that when I'm in a period of not pushing myself in every single level, that, I feel like I'm not living up to my expectations for myself, I'm not improving, when in reality, it's necessary and needed to figure out when to push yourself and when not to. Like, it's totally okay not to force a cold shower every time you take a shower. That's psycho.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
Thank you for the permission to not do that.
Just finding the right balance, I think, is also key. So also don't be hard on yourself if you're not in this kind of self-improvement mode, because it can be an exhausting place to be in all the time.
Totally. Yeah, this is an important caveat. And we could probably do a whole episode on like figuring out where that line is of when to push a little bit more and when to rest a little bit more. I think actually we probably all need a little bit more rest than we think.
I was going to argue for that.
Yeah. And think about maybe just new and creative ways to push things. It doesn't necessarily have to be your sport, but for me, it's like, okay, well, I hate pickleball and I'm not good at it. So I'm going to go out and do it because it's something that's hard, because I don't like not being good at something. And that's a good example of something to maybe flex. That's not necessarily going to tax my body with more endurance activity, for example, or run up a bigger mountain or do a longer triathlon or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. I remember thinking about this in terms of comfort zones. Like, I traveled for a while when I was 22, and I remember one of my goals being to push myself outside of my comfort zone. And then I realized in that experience that my comfort zone itself had layers, and there was like my physical comfort zone of like, this feels hard to my body, my emotional comfort zone, like this is like stressful and I'm overwhelmed. And then there was this interpersonal comfort zone that's also emotional, but like a different kind of emotional, where it's like I was anxious about how I was interacting with people, both the new people I was meeting, how people were perceiving me as this, young white woman traveler, and the people I was still connecting with at home. And I realized in that experience that like I was really comfortable with my physical comfort zone or being outside of it. So if I'm pushing myself in my physical comfort zone, that's actually not that challenging to me anymore, because it's actually a comfortable place for me to be, as ironic as that sounds. My emotional comfort zone definitely expanded through that experience, so I was really happy about that. But I didn't even work on the interpersonal side at all. And that was something that I wanted to have a goal coming out of that experience with. And it just is a reminder that like, it's easy to get comfortable with a certain kind of discomfort. And so maybe finding the right way to keep pushing yourself in a way that is authentic to you and this feels like the right thing to do. But, you know, at this point, like maybe you're comfortable going for hard rides because you know you can do it and you've done it a bajillion times. So it's actually a safe place for you to be. And that's fine, but maybe not the same as like trying to push yourself into the pickleball world like Katie.
No, I mean, I love that reframe so much. And I think actually maybe as endurance athletes, pushing ourselves could actually look like resting. It doesn't necessarily mean more physical discomfort. It can be like, hey, it is really outside of my comfort zone and something that I don't want to do to take an extra rest day because I'm used to a certain amount of movement every day. But if you then do that, you say like, all right, I'm going to sit in this discomfort and take that extra rest day. Like that can be a resilience data point. I don't actually know if it changes your brain. I think maybe it would based on what we've read about this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think
it would.
The point is a new stimulus and something that feels like it's hard and that you don't want to do. So don't always interpret this as you have to do more and longer. It might actually mean doing a little bit less.
Absolutely. I love that perspective. And it reminded me of this other quote that we got that I would love to read, where someone said, somewhat ironically, I'm leaning into self-belief after dropping out of my A race for this year. I had my sights set on the New York Marathon. I've had a difficult time in the last 4 weeks with plantar fasciitis and kept thinking and hoping I could overcome it. I didn't give up on things, yet my self-belief is what's saving me from running a race that would likely cause longer-term damage to my foot and impact my ability to run beyond November 3rd. My self-belief reminds me that I'm bigger and stronger than any one race, that by listening to my inner knowing when it's saying running is pain, not joy, and there's no glory or success to be won, I win. I am choosing what's right for me, and confident saying no is actually saying yes to me. Choosing me versus what I think I'm supposed to do feels phenomenally liberating. I love that perspective. I thought that was so well written and such a great point, and it's directly hitting what you just mentioned, Katie, on you know, just doing the thing that might feel more like emotionally challenging for you or doesn't feel like the normal thing that you would do is actually practicing that self-belief muscle and practicing that doing the hard thing that person needed. So I love that.
Oh, this is so good. All right. I think that's pretty good on pushing yourself, which again can take lots of different ways and shapes and forms. Let's talk about the next one, which is the idea of community or role models or kind of just inspiration from other people, fostering a pretty good sense of self-belief. So we got a lot of people. I mean, we talk about community a lot on this podcast. It's so important, but it really can push you, I think, to maybe hit the next level of goals because you see other people doing it. You have people to do it with, and it does seem to have a pretty big difference. So I'm going to read two quotes that I think really exemplify what community can do for us in terms of self-belief. The first one says, seeing people who have stories similar to mine and who have gone on to achieve the same things I would like to, whether that's in sport, work, or person endeavors. And the second one just says, surrounding myself with people who support me and love me for who I am has helped me grow my self-belief a ton. So I think there's actually two themes here. And the first one is really important. It's just on inspiration. And I think it's cool to actually maybe be inspired by people who are a little bit more like peers or who don't seem like, oh, this is some Olympic gold medalist that I have no idea how they got there and they were maybe more different and everything. But if you can kind of hear the stories of people who work their way up, I think that's always been really, really helpful for me. And I'm always super inspired to kind of hear people's journeys into sport. And often with a lot of these endurance sports, like very few of us were triathletes as kids, for example, or trail runners as kids. It's like maybe you ran around in the trails or you rode your bike and you like swimming. But in terms of developing as an endurance athlete, so I've always just, been super inspired by that community. And I will say, I always tell the Dartmouth triathlon kids who I meet when I first meet them that I could not swim across the pool when I joined the triathlon team, because I think it's easy to look at like, oh, here's Katie who's been doing triathlon for 10 years and she does Ironmans. That's really cool. But the truth is that I couldn't swim across the pool and I'd never been on a road bike. And I think it's super important to just remind people of that because it's a lot easier to say like, oh, I'm a Dartmouth freshman and maybe I could do an Ironman someday, or maybe I could get better at triathlon, even though I also can't swim across the pool. So that's just a perspective that I've always really tried to keep.
Yep, totally agree. Community is just so important. And, inspiration just speaks to why we need many different role models that are showing many different types of people that they can do these things. So super, super powerful. And then, of course, building your own community of people that are, your biggest cheerleaders and they're supporting you and can go do activities with you, but also just support you throughout your life. And we feel really, really lucky that we have it here at the Endurance Tribe. And we're so grateful for the people that have supported us doing this podcast, supported by sending in their own thoughts. So build your community, know that we're here cheering for you, and be the person that's boosting up the people in your community, because all these little moments of encouragement, I just think it's so easy to forget how all these come together into something bigger than ourselves because we can't see it, but it really is making a difference in people's lives. And so, just be the cheerleaders for people around you.
Yeah. And I want to dig into on that quote that specifically talked about how surrounding yourself with people who support you kind of for who you are rather than what your results are. And we'll probably come back to this point about kind of different forms of external validation. But for me, it's so important leading up to a race to remind myself of the people that do not care about the outcome at all. And probably fewer people care about the outcome actually in the world than I think that they do. But in general, the people who have never really put pressure on me to have any specific outcome, I was really appreciative of like my coach who I work with now said many times the week leading up to the race, like, hey, I'm really proud of you, but not related to the outcome. I'm really proud of you regardless of the outcome. She just kept saying that. And it was important for me to kind of go in and take that pressure off. And I think that actually did allow me to believe in myself, because if I had believed that I was only, worthy of having people feel proud of me based on the outcome, I don't know that it would have gone as well. So just really important to like build others up. And as a coach, I try to do that a lot too, is remind people like getting to the starting line is the win. That's all we care about. Or making the confident decision to not show up at a starting line. That's something I'm really proud of, because I don't really care if people cross the finish line or not. I hope that they do if that's what they want, but it's so much more about supporting them as people.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of, there's a YouTuber/runner content creator named Philly Bowden that some people might already know, that I really like what she puts out there. I'm a big fan of hers. And she ran a big marathon for her, I think this last weekend, and crushed it. But she made a video about her goals, beforehand, and had shared that it was really important for her to reflect on the training block before the race and like really write it down and make sure that she was taking into account how proud she was of the training block before she even had the race, to make sure that that process was totally separated from the outcome and how she felt about how she was showing up. But I thought that's a really important practice. So would encourage everyone to do that, of just like really checking in on, how am I living my life, and am I proud of what I'm doing apart from any kind of outcome? Because it's just, I think, a really powerful exercise to go through.
Oh, I love that. I actually once wrote a race report. I wrote half of it before the race, and it's on the Endurance Drive website. You can read my class of 2023 race report, but that was one of the coolest exercises I did, because I think after a race, it's easy to get caught up in whatever the emotions of the race are, good or bad. But if you can just ground in like, how do I feel right now? How can I be present and not let any race outcome take away from that? I definitely would like +1 on that just being a helpful exercise.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think here, maybe we can transition a little bit into talking about specific things that people have used to help build their self-beliefs, because a lot of these are kind of constructs, but there are actual tools out there. The first one that came up was therapy. We love therapy. We talk about it a lot on the podcast. So if you have not checked in with a therapist ever, and if you struggle with self-belief, or if you don't struggle with self-belief, I still think this is a really good resource to have. And I think it's helpful because often that can give you some perspective on maybe whether the stories that you're telling yourself are even true, and what you can do to kind of cultivate a little bit of that positive self-talk. So would definitely recommend some sort of therapy, or you could work with a mindset coach, or there's a lot of different people out there. Even just like sharing vulnerable thoughts with a friend is an amazing place to start, but not letting them just like sit in your head and eat away at you, I think is probably the worst place for those thoughts to be. And that can definitely shrink your self-belief muscle if you're constantly kind of berating yourself and not getting those thoughts out.
Yep, absolutely. Another one that really came through a lot was mantras. And there was one example that someone wrote that I actually really liked, that they said that they had a race that went really well with their mantra being, I don't have to do this, I get to do this, and I will do this. Whatever it is that resonates for you, the power of having some words in your system. I think when your brain's tired, it can latch onto something and make a difference. I am a huge fan of mantras as well. Maybe write them in your journal, write them on your bathroom mirror. It can seem cheesy, but I think it actually helps a ton. So mantras came through from several people's responses.
And then a couple that also came through on this list. So these are sort of quick tools. Creating structure or routines can be really helpful for cultivating self-belief. Positive self-talk, that's a big one related to therapy. Celebrating the small wins, and then balancing your strengths and weaknesses. A lot of this comes down to just the narratives that we're telling ourselves. So think about pulling these out with or without other people to hear them, or a therapist. Journaling is awesome. And all of these I think are really, really helpful for just helping us feel more grounded when thoughts are like all over the place. Self-belief is kind of under threat. You can kind of ground in all these different practices.
The one other tip that I learned recently on kind of the narratives, like rewriting down those narratives and changing them, is it can also be helpful to, when you're writing down the negative narratives that you're telling yourself, to write out actually how you're secretly benefiting from telling yourself that negative narrative. As in, if I tell myself that what's a good example? If I tell myself that I am lazy and I can't get myself to do anything, then I'm, taking off the responsibility of me even attempting to do anything because, well, I'm lazy. I don't have to do it. And it actually kind of feeds into why you can't get yourself to do something differently, where if you can recognize that you are drawing sneaky benefits from telling yourself a negative narrative, you can actually break the cycle and make it that much easier for you to see why you can actually have a positive narrative and move in a different direction. So it's like subtle work, but I think the journaling practice there can be quite helpful.
Fantastic. Love that. We have one more thought here. I thought this was a really helpful quote that just tells us a little bit about kind of the paradoxical nature of self-belief. And this is related to kind of what's good about it, but also it's a little bit more challenging. So I'll read this one. It says, "It's funny, the very things that have helped me develop self-belief are the very things that can also make me doubt it, which is probably true of a lot of things in our lives. For example, in my career, I had very high self-belief at a time when I took on a new, bigger job managing several teams. I just found my groove. But time goes on, stakes get higher, demands and exposure increase, and all of a sudden you have imposter syndrome. Same goes for sport. I had my peak self-belief when I tried a new thing, triathlon, and I was crushing it in those early days because I had no basis of comparison and no reservations. Then I figured out how it all worked and started putting unnecessary competitive pressure on myself that took a hit on my confidence because, newsflash, performance changes as you age. Ditto with my kids. I was in my absolute groove when my kids were little. I loved being pregnant, loved being a mama. The kids grow up, shit gets real, and all of a sudden you're left wondering how much therapy you're setting them up for. So bottom line, I think self-belief is very fluid. You can build it, you can lose it, because we human creatures are not consistent and we're not always kind to ourselves. And I think this is so true and just shows how much self-belief can, number one, move around a lot, day to day, hour to hour, year to year, and also can show up in different ways in different facets of our lives. And, we're all, for the most part, endurance athletes, but we're not only that. And so just validating, it can be really, really hard as we see these beliefs change, especially in the context of something that we've previously felt really confident about. I definitely can resonate with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that quote. Okay, great. Well, should we transition a little bit into talking about more of the negative side or things that get in the way and maybe how we can overcome those based on the things we've already talked about?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, great. Okay. So one big thing that got in the way that came up a couple times, which I thought was really interesting and also resonated a lot with me, was societal norms, particularly societal norms around humility. So someone wrote, "I often discredit any type of achievement and finding excuses outside of myself as to why they might have happened. It started as a way to stay humble, but can manifest as not accepting my own accomplishments." I totally get this. I am curious. I don't want to make that statement, but I think it could be more common in women than in men because of societal norms of, not expressing that you're awesome or staying a little bit more behind the scenes. I do think this is something that maybe starts as a way of, it's good to stay grounded, good to stay humble, always think that, but it can be really hard for people to hold the values of humility and confidence side by side, and finding a way to have those coexist, I think, is incredibly important, but not something that is easily shown, especially growing up in society, depending on the environment that you grew up in.
Yeah, a piece of advice that I received once was, if you're thinking a lot about whether you're coming off as too confident, you're probably not. You're probably coming off a little bit more on the humble side. Because I think that people who are annoyingly confident, I'm pretty sure they don't think too much or overthink the idea of whether they're being confident or not. They're just showing up. And, sometimes we've all seen people who it goes too far in the opposite direction. But if you're constantly a little bit anxious about it going too hard in the direction, you're probably okay. And you could probably give yourself a little bit more credit.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. I remember the first time I came across a guy in college who was just so confident. And I had asked him something. He's like, yeah, of course. Why would I never even crossed my mind. I was like, what would it be like to be like that?
Imagine that. That for sure.
Okay. So yeah, just an interesting point that came up a couple of times. The next one that also came up a few times was the idea of setting too high of expectations, which is directly related to comparison and kind of continuing to raise the bar on yourself. So you're just never good enough. And that can be a slippery slope. And that was, it reminded me of Mac's poem that she read on an episode a few weeks ago of just never looking to see the view when you keep striving for more and more and more. So a couple quotes there. Someone said, "Failure, rejection, and unrealistic expectations I put on myself. I often set myself up for failure because I set the bar too high, try to do too much, and compare myself to others." Some of their notes, comparing myself to professional athletes or feeling imposter syndrome. We're our own worst critics. For me, self-belief is most tied with whether or not I meet my expectations. So I think goal setting is really important. In the past, I've felt the least self-confidence when I set outsized expectations on myself. I think sometimes I don't always see an accurate picture. So something I'm working on is looking to others I trust to give me advice and guidance, even if it is scary to share my big goals with them. Just a really important way of thinking about that is if you're realizing that you're giving yourself outsized expectations, turning to others, turning to your community and helping people keep you in check and grounded, and you're not always raising the bar on yourself and able to, accept where you are and keep your head above water, I think is a really great way of tackling this. So I'm really glad that person wrote that in.
Totally. And I think this also reminds me another piece of advice that I've gotten in terms of thinking about setting expectations and continuing to raise the bar and wondering if that will ever be enough. Is like, if you're not enough right now, exactly where you are, you won't be enough with that next thing, with that next podium, with that next Ironman finish, whatever it is. You have to work on just feeling enough without having any of that. And that's something that's like a work in progress for me, for sure. But I certainly have, as I've progressed through the sport, felt more and more pressure each time I do well to then do better the next time. And I think anytime I can lean into not focusing on those outcomes and focusing on why I'm doing this and what my purpose is and what the process is, I do actually have those better results, not always, but often. So trying to just ask yourself, like, why am I here? And do I need that thing? You shouldn't ever need it. It's nice to have, but it's not going to be the driving force of your goals. And yeah, always process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, interestingly, when people wrote in when they felt the most self-confidence or self-belief in their life, a few of the responses were when I first got involved with endurance sports, like that first year, the first couple years, which was interesting because to me, that kind of showed a little bit of the, hey, really helped me with feeling I could push myself. I got a ton of self-belief from doing this. And then the bar started to rise, and maybe that made it more challenging, which I think is a really common progression for people. You don't have the novelty of like, wow, I just did that thing. I was talking to a friend about that recently, like trying to take on the second big race they did. Well, I already showed myself I could do the first big thing. So what does it feel like now to know I can do that? But now I have like time goals for myself, or I'm trying to figure that out. It's like stressing me out. I think it can be really challenging. So yeah, just keep awareness of that for yourself so that you are keeping it fun, keeping it exciting, keeping it as a tool for self-improvement and self-expression, and not something that's stressful and hurting your self-belief.
Totally. All right. Next one here is just this sort of generalized feeling of lingering self-doubt, or also imposter syndrome, which also just came up in the last one. But one person said that something that holds them back is previous versions of myself that no longer align with who I am now or how I behave. When those thoughts sneak up on me now, I observe them and stick to the facts of the current situation. What is happening? What actions can I take to have the outcome that aligns with the values of my current self? And I think, we talk about comparison to others, but I do think that comparison to ourselves is one of the hardest things to overcome here. And this can manifest in lots of different ways. Like maybe you have experienced an injury and you know that you are nowhere near as fast or as fit as you used to be. Then you see Strava's like, look how fast you were 2 years ago doing this thing. I think that's really, really challenging because it's not even like an external thing. It's actually you that you might feel like you're not living up to. But I think grounding in like, hey, where am I today and what can I do right now and how can I celebrate that is a really nice place to start there and just try to challenge self-doubt and really want to +1 on this like point about what is actually fact and what is just a story that you're making up to tell yourself. I think all of us make up those stories, but really, really important to ground in the now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Next one, I think is a really important one, is the idea of competing priorities and your own emotional bandwidth, which I think is something that we might forget about often. So this person wrote, I manage my self-belief less well when I have a lot of competing priorities, especially emotional ones. When I have something stressful with my kids and my spouse and my work and my siblings and my parents, my confidence about my ability to manage it all can really take a hit. There's only so much by way of an emotional reserve any of us has. And when that gets fully tapped because you're spending it on other people, you leave very little left for yourself. I have found myself wondering if I'm doing anything well or just doing a lot of things really shitty. I think we've all felt this way at any point that we felt overwhelmed. It's so important to recognize that when we're really stressed, when our emotional bandwidth is super depleted, we're not giving ourselves the care that we need, and that will have some effects in terms of how we feel about ourselves. And that's just I think a pattern that I've been able to recognize in myself. So then I think learning the tools the kind of self-care that you need in those moments, the way that you cope with that, is a really important thing that I haven't by no means figured out entirely, but recognizing this as a pattern, I think is a really good place to start. So give yourself grace because stress is stress. We say that a lot. Stress is stress. So it's not just coming from training, it's from other things too. So yeah, makes sense that you can't help yourself when you're overburdened with other things as well.
Yeah. And the importance too of asking for help. Like when you're feeling this way, I've definitely felt this way so many different times when I've just have so many competing priorities and I feel like I'm doing poorly at every single one of them. But often there's people who are super, super willing to help you out or just take some of those burdens. And if you can even remove like 3% of what you have to do, sometimes that's enough to just get 3% more self-belief or something. And it's like, if you're already having all this stress, I don't know that it's great to also have your internal narrative be really, really negative. Of course, those things are sometimes causal and come together, but anything you can do to just relieve that burden a little bit should have some important kind of countervailing effects on self-belief. So anything you can do to kind of manage that. It doesn't have to be anything big, and celebrate the small things that you do is really important as well.
Absolutely. All right. Last big category that we had for things that get in the way of self-belief is just this idea of fear. And we kind of related a little bit to what we call little T trauma, just little things that have developed over your life that can get in the way of you feeling great about yourself. So we're going to read a couple quotes. We might cut these a little bit down, but we'll see. So I'll start with one. Fear of failure and feelings of overwhelm. Not a knock on my parents at all. I love them. But I think they had and continue to have very rigid ideas of what girls, women should and shouldn't do. Girls shouldn't have muscles. They shouldn't talk a certain way. They should keep your head down and do the work, which is just flat out always terrible advice. It really did a number on my confidence and belief that what I wanted to do or accomplish was acceptable. It also didn't help that none of my friends liked to do the things I like to do. And before social media took off, it was harder to find role models to look up to. I feel so grateful for the people who have come before me and had the bravery to totally defy all of those wrong preconceptions, because it does show me, hey, there isn't one right or wrong way to do things, and everyone's right might look a little different.
Oh, this is so good. I love that. And I relate to that a lot. And I think we do have to think a little bit about kind of the environment we were raised in. And I think for most people, like, our parents all do the very best that they can, but there's a lot of societal influences. There's a lot of environmental influences that can sort of shape our perceptions of ourselves. And starting to just unlock that and understand where that comes from, I think, is the first step to being able to challenge it. A related quote here that I'll read says, "So many of our beliefs are developed in our childhood, but it's when we begin to have our own experience with life as adults that those beliefs are challenged. It wasn't until my mid-30s that I really evaluated some of the patterns I had developed, especially in family dynamics. Stepping into the person I wanted to be meant stepping away from a lot of relationships that were keeping me in those negative patterns of self-doubt. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen over time, but really trusting my own values and beliefs, not ones that were put on me by someone else, allowed me to become a more authentic version of myself." And I do think there is something here to the link between authenticity and self-belief. When you feel like you're totally in line with your values and you can show up and be authentic and not really worry what about other people think, like, that sort of sounds like the best version of self-belief. That sounds like the people who say 10 on their 1 to 10 self-belief and say that their self-belief is maxing out right now. But it's hard to do. And I want to validate that it doesn't happen overnight at all. It can be a process that takes years of a spiritual journey to unlock, which we've been talking, kind of joking about our spiritual journey, but it's definitely related to self-belief in different ways. So yeah, just shout out to this listener. It's a really powerful point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also shows that, it seems like people that are kind of past that 20s period, like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s plus, have expressed like more and more developing self-belief, which might not always be the case. But I think that speaks to this journey that we're all on as humans. And I mean, we can joke about how, puberty is, super hard. The 20s are a really hard decade because you're figuring so much out about yourself. And it's like really just showing up to do the work for yourself and keep experimenting and figuring out what feels right, trying things on for yourself. But yeah, it gives me optimism, actually, to see how a lot of our community responded to these polls, because I'm like, wow, I really do think that it will keep getting better because we just keep getting to learn more stuff about ourselves. So I'm inspired, and I hope that I do feel that way as I continue to move on. I want the answer to always be now. It might not always be in that single moment, but at a whole level, I think my self-belief should always be highest now moving forward. So yeah, that's great.
I love it. All right, well, let's finish. Let's rapid fire. We got some amazing quotes that I think all should be on like a t-shirt or a mug, but instead we're just going to read them now and hopefully leave you all with some wisdom that you can take to your inner thoughts and to your lives. So first quote here, just sort of general tips and advice, says, "Fake it till you make it isn't really great for all situations, but sometimes that little fake it is enough to carry you into the self-belief and realization that I can do this." And this makes me think of like people going to their first triathlon. It's sometimes kind of scary to look around the transition area, but you could just walk in there and fake it till you make it and act like you own the place and know what's going on. And you will probably have a better race if you do that. And if you need to, you can also ask for help. But yeah, I love this. This situational fake it till you make it advice is fantastic.
Yep, I love it too. All right, next. We are all perfectly imperfect exactly as we are. There's a lot of peace and ease that comes with recognizing that. I love that. I think that's very beautiful. And yeah, that should be on a t-shirt. Why is that on a t-shirt?
We're going to start a t-shirt business in addition to this podcast because we don't do enough.
It's like the new form of, the millennial house art.
Yes, exactly.
Well, that's where the heart is. We're all perfectly imperfect.
Next one. So this is some specific pieces of advice for when you're not feeling like enough. It says, I've learned to turn my curiosity to 11, Spinal Tap reference for the Gen X crew, when I'm feeling not enough. What's the origin of my doubt? What can I learn? Practice. Do. This immediately helps me feel more settled. Regardless of whether I do actually measure up or not, learning more about the thing that's challenging me will help me get stronger, smarter, and calmer. I also practice reframing. What is the story I'm telling myself? What are the actual facts? And what's the reframe? And when in doubt and nothing else works, I head to the trails and find solace in the steady rhythm of my feet and the calm peace of the trees. This is an awesome drill down. You can basically go through all the steps and know that at the very end, trees and nature will probably help. I find that sometimes if I'm losing a sense of self-belief, at least getting out of my head by going somewhere in nature is a great place to kind of work on that. And we have been talking a lot about some very heavy kind of deep diving internally. I would say nature is a better place to do that than like inside in the dark and not having any sunlight would be my recommendation.
Yeah, change your environment. Just even changing your environment makes a difference. So love that. Okay. And the next one is also similarly on that like a mindset shifting point. So someone wrote, there have been a lot of moments in my life where I've thought, I wish I could do XYZ. And one day I had a friend ask me, then why don't you? Triathlon ended up being one of those things. And since then, I've come to realize that any sentence that starts with I wish is an opportunity to chase after what you want to do. These days, I am trying to be the role model that I would have wanted to have when I was younger. I love that whole thing. I really love that summary of like, I'm trying to be the role model that I would have wanted to be when I was younger. I was reflecting on that, like maybe that just sums up our mission here. Like we're just trying to do the same things, Katie and I, that we would have wanted to see when we were younger. And I think it's a really great way of thinking about how you can keep pursuing things in your life. Just reframing. If you don't think you can, why is that? Can you go do that? Is it something that you want to go do? Go chase after it because you only get one life. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah. I really wish that when I was younger that there was a podcast I could listen to that was like sort of quasi-spiritual, but mostly endurance and taught me about the self-belief that I needed in order to succeed in life. It would have actually probably saved me from a lot of heartache growing up. So we're trying for that. That's the goal.
Yeah, exactly. A little quasi-spiritual rambling. That sounds great.
It's perfect. Well, people keep coming back. So I don't know. There's something to it. And that's helping my self-belief too, that like we can do whatever episode and then some people come back. Some fraction of the previous week is usually always there to hear us ramble. So thank you to our listeners for bolstering our sense of self-belief. And even more for just giving us all of these really great insights. Again, like this was really us sharing what the community had to say on self-belief. And we are super inspired. We'll keep saying it by each and every one of you. I feel like I've learned a lot today, probably a lot more than I've shared. And we will also say that there were so many nuggets of wisdom in here that we could probably do a whole series. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to these themes because, again, I've said this before, I think fitness is a very small percentage of your ability to kind of execute in races. And I think the actual tangible things that you do in your job, for example, are a very small piece of what you need to execute in work, in life, etc. So much of it comes down to those sort of mindset pieces and the belief. So everyone who wants to invest in that, you will definitely reap a lot of benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And words are very powerful. So I know that I feel a lot better after reading so many of these things. So thank you to everyone who shared the words. Thank you to everyone who's paying attention because I really think that it will help. So awesome. Okay. Should we move on to the quick gear pick of the week to wrap up?
Yes, I love the gear pick of the week, and I get excited when I can come up with a new one because, as we said, we were like 51 episodes in, and that's a lot of gear picks of the week. But I have a new favorite sports bra, so ladies in the audience recommending the Lululemon Bend This Scoop and Square bra. It's super comfy. I wouldn't say it's like great for super high impact stuff, but I've been wearing it all around for sort of lighter impact type work, and it's really comfy. So highly recommend. When you find a good bra, you have to tell the whole world about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I need to check that out.
Yeah,
I'm on the hunt actually, so I will probably get that. Great. Okay, mine's short and sweet. I would imagine most people maybe have this or know about it, but the TheraCane, if you don't, it's just like this weird cane device that you can use as a pressure point thing to dig into back muscles. And with a lot of the travel that I've had and my back being tight anyways, it's made a huge difference. It's just really helpful to have like something that you can just like stick in there and try to unknot it when you don't have time to go find a masseuse.
for an hour. So
Yeah, if you're struggling with any kind of tightness in your back, I think that this is a great tool. It's really cheap. It's very helpful. So check it out.
incredible recommendation. Okay. Well, thank you as always to everyone for listening. Please consider dropping us a rating or a review if you haven't yet. We would really, really appreciate it. And yeah, we're excited to be back next week with more insight, more spirituality probably, and a small amount of endurance principles, because that's also what we're about here at the Endurance Drive. Thanks, everyone.